Hey y'all, welcome to Chapter 9. We're going to cover cellular respiration and fermentation. This is how we get energy from food that we eat. And I'm just going to tell you my little background story. So the first time I was taught cellular respiration, I had no idea what was going on. I kind of muddled through it, but I really didn't have a clue. Second time, I understood a little bit more. Still didn't really know. It took probably 3 or 4 biology classes, 3 or 4 like semesters of biology classes, teachers teaching me the same thing before I really understood it. So this chapter, I think, is like the most beautiful chapter we talk about. The things that go on in these processes is just gorgeous. But it also can be a little complex. So you have to, in this chapter, 1, pay attention and take good notes, and 2, be comfortable with not understanding everything. It's okay if some of these things just leave you a little bit unsure of what exactly is going on, as long as you can kind of tell me the facts of what is going on. So I have, hang on, you have papers like this that I will give you that go through the different steps. If you are able to fill in this chart, even if you don't really understand how it's getting there, if you're able to fill in the chart, I'm happy with your understanding of this chapter, okay? And then if you're going into biology, you can come back and take another biology class and start figuring it out. And by the time you graduate, you'll understand it too, okay? So get what you can, spend your time memorizing, taking notes, and it's okay if it's a hot mess, okay? This is a chapter for it to be. We are going to work on this and work on this and work on this. We'll spend a few days in class working on this so that you can really understand what we're doing. Okay, so let's jump in. So life is work. There's a kind of depressing statement. You have to be constantly working to stay alive, though. Cells have to be constantly working, and they constantly need energy from something outside of themselves to be able to do the work they need to do. So some of the things they need to do is assembling polymers, so building DNA, building molecules, moving things across the transport, moving themselves, reproducing. These take a lot of energy. So as animals, we get this energy by eating other things. We're either eating other animals or eating photosynthetic organisms, so plants. Okay, energy is going to flow into the ecosystem as sunlight, and it's eventually going to leave as heat. While the molecules of life are going to be recycled. So the carbon and the oxygen, these get recycled, but the energy is going to leave as heat. And we're going to have oxygen that is going to be required to make ATP, and that is going to be to come through cellular. We're going to make that ATP through cellular respiration. So while it is using the oxygen that we're breathing, it is not really respiration in the term of breathing. Cellular respiration is referring to cells getting energy from their food sources. And carbon dioxide is going to be a byproduct or waste of this process. So in this process, we're going to take some organic molecule, sugar or fat or whatever it is, that's based on carbon, right? And oxygen, and we're going to break down that carbon molecule in your mitochondria, the powerhouse of your cell. We're going to break down that sugar all the way down to carbon dioxide. And in that process, we have obtained a lot of ATP to do your cell work, and you've also made some heat. Okay, let's watch this.
Could a carbon atom that was once part of Albert Einstein be in you? All living things need to take in carbon-containing molecules to fuel their activity and build their cells. This is true for busy students and for all organisms. Let's look at how carbon atoms move through the carbon cycle in the Arctic tundra. Carbon atoms from carbon dioxide are incorporated into living things by producers, such as this plant. Carbon dioxide enters a leaf, moves into a cell, and goes into a chloroplast. There, in the process of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is used to make sugar molecules. The sugars can be used to build larger carbon-containing molecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. In this way, carbon that was in the air is now part of the plant. When a plant is eaten by an herbivore, or primary consumer, carbon in plant tissue enters the primary consumer's digestive system. There, plant molecules are broken down. These small molecules are then used by the primary consumer to make larger molecules for building its own tissues. In this way, some of the carbon that was in a plant becomes carbon in a primary consumer. Similarly, when a primary consumer is eaten by a higher level consumer, some of the carbon in the primary consumer is incorporated into the higher level consumer. Carbon-containing molecules in dead plant material, animal feces, and dead organisms are taken up by decomposers, such as fungi and bacteria. Decomposers break down these materials and incorporate some of the carbon atoms into their own bodies. We have now seen how carbon moves from carbon dioxide to producers, to primary consumers, to higher level consumers, and to decomposers. How does carbon get back to the atmosphere? During cellular respiration, carbon-containing molecules are broken down and ATP is made. Carbon dioxide is released as a byproduct and returned to the atmosphere by producers, consumers, and decomposers. Overall, this return of carbon dioxide by cellular respiration is closely balanced by its removal from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. The global carbon cycle involves living things on land and in rivers, lakes, and oceans. And by the way, considering the huge number of carbon atoms in each person and how quickly carbon atoms move through the carbon cycle, there is almost certainly a little of Einstein in each of us.
Okay, so you're a little bit Einstein self. Let's talk about cellular respiration now. So cellular respiration is a series of controlled reactions. So it is going to be done by specific enzymes. You have to have those enzymes or you can't do it. And through these enzymes, we make ATP, and it's very efficient. So about 38% of the energy in glucose ends up as ATP. The rest of that energy is going to be lost as heat to the environment. When we are talking about plant cells and animal cells, cellular respiration is going to occur in our mitochondria. And photosynthesis will occur in the chloroplast of plant cells, but not animals. We don't have chloroplasts and we don't do photosynthesis. So overall, the catabolic equation for cellular respiration is going to be glucose plus oxygen is going to be broken down to carbon dioxide, water, and energy. This is flipped around backwards for photosynthesis, which is carbon dioxide, water, and energy are going to be combined to make glucose and oxygen. So in people, as we're doing cellular respiration, we do have to breathe in oxygen and we'll breathe out carbon dioxide as a waste product. Catabolic pathways will release the energy that is stored in your food molecules, and they release it by breaking down those food molecules. So an organic compound has a lot of chemical energy, and that chemical energy is mainly held in the electrons of their bonds. So in this chapter, you need to be paying attention to where the electrons are moving. A lot of this we'll talk about in terms of what's happening to carbon, but carbon is not the energy. Carbon is what we're building stuff from, but the energy is in electrons. So where the electrons are moving is where you are getting energy. Organic compounds can participate in exergonic reactions. Exergonic reactions release energy. And then the energy that isn't used to do cell work is released as heat. And ATP is going to be built through these exergonic reactions, and it will be used to do chemical work in your body. So things like your muscles moving, breathing, having a heartbeat, being able to process the information as I'm talking to you right now. The breakdown of organic molecules is exergonic. And we're going to talk about a few different catabolic pathways. The main one we're focusing on is aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration will take your sugar or other organic molecules, and it'll take oxygen, break it all the way down to carbon dioxide, and create ATP. If oxygen isn't available, some organisms can live without oxygen, although we can't. Some organisms can live without oxygen, and they'll do what's called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is going to be aerobic respiration that doesn't use oxygen. It's going to have something else in place of oxygen. There's also fermentation. Fermentation is when you partially break down sugars, so you're not breaking it all the way down to carbon dioxide. It's kind of an emergency stopgap for cells that are temporarily without oxygen so that they can continue functioning. And fermentation will usually end up giving you something like lactic acid or alcohol. Okay, so cellular respiration is overall aerobic. Parts of it will require oxygen, but it has both aerobic and anaerobic processes. And our foods are going to be the fuel for cellular respiration. It's what we're going to burn down to create carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to be breathed out as a waste, and water. So you're going to have glucose and oxygen break into carbon dioxide and water. You're going to have 36 to 38 ATP, that's kind of like little coins that are energy, and heat that just gets released from you. So overall this is exergonic because it's releasing heat. Okay, so we said electrons are what is holding energy. So let's talk about things about moving electrons around. If you have picked up an electron, you have gained an electron, you are reduced. So chlorine that picks up an electron is reduced. It'll be left with a negative charge, and it's called reduced because its charge goes down. If you lose an electron, you are oxidized. It has this term oxidized because we used to not really understand what was happening. But if you lose an electron, you have become oxidized. So sodium that loses an electron becomes Na+, it is oxidized. Okay, these are always going to be coupled together. If something is oxidized, something else is going to be reduced because electrons don't just magically appear and disappear. So when something is oxidized, something else is reduced, and these are called redox reactions. Okay, as we relocate in electrons, we can release some of the energy in them, and as we slowly take that energy out of electrons, it's going to eventually lead to synthesizing ATP. Okay, so this is what we just talked about, redox reactions, oxidation, reduction. These are terms that you need to just absolutely memorize and be very comfortable with. Okay, during cellular respiration, the starting fuel, glucose, is going to be oxidized. It is going to have its electrons taken out. It's not going to change its charge overall because it's also going to lose protons along with it, but its charge, it's going to be oxidized to carbon dioxide. So it is losing its electrons to become carbon dioxide. Oxygen is going to become reduced to water, so it's going to pick up those electrons to make water. And in the process of that, in the process of electrons being transferred from glucose to water, you are going to take the energy out of those electrons and release it as energy that can be used to make ATP. So the energy is released as electrons, and those electrons are going to be associated with hydrogens, are going to be transferred to oxygen, and that is going to be a lower energy state. So this molecule of glucose has a lot of energy in its electrons. We're going to take the electrons out, move them around, and take the energy out of them. Eventually, oxygen is going to pick up those oxygen is going to pick up those electrons along with hydrogens and become water. In cellular respiration, glucose and other organic molecules are broken down in a series of steps. It's not just one big explosion and hope you catch it all in that second. It's very slow and controlled. And as glucose is broken down, it's not going to straight up pass its electrons to oxygen in one big step. It's going to do it in those steps. So oxygen is going to go through electron carriers. So the electrons move from glucose to these carriers and eventually are picked up by oxygen. So we have two kinds of carriers. One is NAD+, and one is FAD. Actually, it's FADH. Okay. When NAD plus and FAD pick up electrons, they also pick up hydrogen atoms. So NAD is going to be the oxidized form, NAD plus. As it is reduced, as it picks up these electrons, it becomes NADH. Okay, so NAD plus is oxidized. It picks up electrons. Now it's reduced as NADH. NADH, carrying those electrons, has a lot of energy in it. So NADH is an energy carrier, but it's not a kind of energy that your cell can use. It still has to be transferred to ATP. NADH is just holding on to that energy for the final reactions. FAD can be reduced to FADH2. So we're going to have NAD and FAD be picking up electrons, carrying them as NADH and FADH2 to the electron transport chain. When they have dropped off their electrons at the electron transport chain, they return back to being NAD plus and FAD. So NAD and FAD are our energy carriers, kind of the intermediates carrying those energized electrons to the electron transport chain. Okay, so NADH passes electrons to the electron transport chain. This slowly passes electrons down a series of steps, getting the energy out of the electrons during each step, and eventually those electrons are left without their energy. They're picked up by hydrogen, and the electrons along with hydrogen are picked up by oxygen and make water. So oxygen pulls these electrons down this process, releasing energy. And that energy that's released is used to make ATP. Okay, I am 90% sure that you are confused at this point. So just go back, and it's okay to go back and just kind of write out your notes. And if you can kind of make sense of the framework of it, even if you don't understand how this is working, if you understand that energy is passing as electrons. Electrons are going from glucose to NADH to water, or FADH to water. And that process, as it's picked up by oxygen, it loses its energy, and the energy from electrons is turned into ATP. Even if you don't understand how it's going on, I'm okay if you don't understand the how in this chapter, if you can tell me the what for this chapter. Okay, this is going to, all of this that we just talked about happens in 3 stages: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. So glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. Those are the 3 stages. The intermediate reaction doesn't make energy, so we don't call it a stage. In your textbook, I think, I'm not sure if it refers to Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. I think it calls it citric acid cycle, but those are the same thing. I think the amoeba sisters call it Krebs cycle. So just be aware that Krebs cycle and citric acid cycle both mean the same thing. In glycolysis, that literally means sugar breaking. We take a molecule of glucose and break it in half. When we break it in half, we make 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay, so that's step 1. Then the intermediate reaction is the decarboxylation of pyruvate. Decarboxylation is a big word. It means to yank off a carbon dioxide. So pyruvate is going to become acetyl-CoA because it has its carbon dioxide mixed up, just dripped off. So we've already breathed out a couple of carbon dioxide then by the time we're here. Then in a citric acid cycle, we are going to complete the breakdown of glucose. So in the citric acid cycle, we have broken down all the rest of that acetyl-CoA to carbon dioxide. We have no carbons left. At that point, we have a lot of NADH and FADH2 carrying electrons. They take their electrons to the electron transport chain, where we have oxidative phosphorylation. We're going to make a lot of ATP. So glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, and citric acid cycle are all breaking down energy, breaking down our carbon, breaking down our sugar. Electron transport chain is taking the energy from electrons, and then chemiosmosis is making ATP. Okay, so glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. Be able to tell me where it happens, and it makes 2 ATP. The intermediate reaction occurs in the outer mitochondrial membrane and requires oxygen. The Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. That's the middle of the mitochondria, and makes 2 ATP. And then the oxidative phosphorylation is going to be in the mitochondrial membranes, in the inner membrane, which is called, it's in the cristae. And it's going to make most of the ATP. we're going to watch this video, and then I encourage you to pause at this point, watch the Amoeba Sisters video, fill in your form, and then we'll pick up after that.
As this mountain biker heads up the trail, the breakfast he ate this morning is being burned to power his bike ride. His breathing rate increases as his leg muscles demand more oxygen to burn more fuel. Let's zoom down to where this fuel is burned, our cells. Here, the blood vessel on the left delivers fuel and oxygen to a single muscle cell. In cellular respiration, energy and fuel is converted to ATP, shown here as starbursts. Most ATP is made in the cell's mitochondria. ATP powers the work of the cell, such as contraction. Let's take a closer look at how ATP is produced from a molecule of glucose, our fuel. Only the carbon skeleton is shown to keep things simple. The first step is called glycolysis, and it takes place outside the mitochondria. To begin the process, some energy has to be invested. Next, the molecule is split in half. Now, the molecule NAD+, an electron carrier, picks up electrons and hydrogen atoms from the carbon molecule, becoming NADH. Keep track of the electron carriers. They play an important role by transporting electrons to reactions in the mitochondria. In the final steps of glycolysis, some ATP is produced, but not much. For every glucose molecule, only 2 net ATPs are produced outside the mitochondrion. However, glycolysis has produced pyruvic acid, which still has a lot of energy available. Let's follow this pyruvic acid molecule into a mitochondrion to see where most of the energy is extracted. As the molecule enters the mitochondrion, 1 carbon is removed, forming carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Electrons are stripped, forming NADH. Coenzyme A attaches to the 2-carbon fragment, forming acetyl-CoA. Coenzyme A is removed, and the remaining 2-carbon skeleton is attached to an existing 4-carbon molecule that serves as the starting point for the citric acid cycle. The new 6-carbon chain is partially broken down, releasing carbon dioxide. Several electrons are captured by electron carriers, and more carbon dioxide is released. The carbon dioxide that you exhale comes from the reactions of cellular respiration. 2 ATPs are produced by the citric acid cycle for each molecule of glucose. At this point, only a small number of ATPs have been produced. However, more energy is available in the electrons that are being transported by electron carriers. While the citric acid cycle starts another round, let's follow an electron carrier to the next step in the process. Electron carriers such as NADH deliver their electrons to an electron transport chain embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. The chain consists of a series of electron carriers, most of which are proteins that exist in large complexes. Electrons are transferred from one electron carrier to the next in the electron transport chain. Let's take a closer look at the path electrons take through the chain. As electrons move along each step of the chain, they give up a bit of energy. The oxygen you breathe pulls electrons from the transport chain, and water is formed as a byproduct. The energy released by electrons is used to pump hydrogen ions, the blue balls, across the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, creating an area of high hydrogen ion concentration. Hydrogen ions flow back across the membrane through a turbine. Much like water through a dam, the flow of hydrogen ions spins the turbine, which activates the production of ATP. These spinning turbines in your cells produce most of the ATP that is generated from the food you eat. The process you've just observed, cellular respiration, generates 10 million ATPs per second in just one cell. That ATP can power a biker up the trail, or it can power your brain cells as you learn challenging biology topics.
Okay, so at this point, we have covered a lot of stuff. So please take this form. Can you see it? Take that form, fill it out, and come back to this, okay? I want you to watch the Amoeba Sisters video, and I want you to fill out your form between what you just watched, what we've talked about, and what was in the Amoeba Sisters video, because we're about to go into that in a lot of detail. So I just want you to have the basic scaffolding of it, and we'll come back for Chapter 9, Part 2. Okay, see you in a little bit. Bye.